I'm going to go ahead
Yeah.
and give the next talk, and we're going to have a bit of a philosophical conversation on managing cost. And the reason for that is realistically, there is no way to spend $610 on a Medicare totally. And this morning during Stefan's surgery, he said 8,600. But just so you know, in New York, we get that extra $10 for our Medicare. So that's our big cost of living change. But how do you do it, right? How do you make joint replacements in your surgery center, especially those that are being wildly undervalued, work for you? And the first thing I'm going to say before we really get started is that we really shouldn't, right? Like we need to have a better strategy with our government payers to let them know that, like, realistically, just cutting how much you pay people at a surgery center to a point that it's unsustainable won't actually accomplish the goal. It'll just make people not shift site of service. So hopefully, if anybody's on the call who has some connections into CMS, they can remind them that this actually probably just isn't a great strategy. But I will talk about some of the things that are important when you start to think of spending money in your surgery center, regardless of exactly how much it is. As surgeons always do, we throw up our disclosures. Probably my most important disclosure is that I'm the president of the HSS Ambulatory Surgery Center Development Network, which runs all ambulatory surgery centers for all of HSS across the globe. Really nothing to do with this except that obviously my job entails a lot of work in and around surgery centers, both on the clinical and business side. So when I think about costs, and if you think anytime that there's costs associated with anything we do, we break them down into fixed costs, into variable costs, and in the world of surgery, what I like to think of as optional costs, right? These are things that you don't absolutely need, but you might really want. And certainly surgeons spend a lot on optional costs because we see the value in them. And so when we talk about fixed costs are the things you absolutely need no matter what, and they're always there. Stefan, again, referenced this earlier on the sterilizer that is in the Innovate Center. And I think you can never overspend on sterilization if you're building a surgery center. One of the biggest limitations of surgery centers, and we talked about this earlier, is the ability to sterilize. And whether it's that you're retrofitting or starting to do higher acuity surgeries in a center that's been up for a while, dealing with the limitations of sterilization are critical. And whether that means you're going to actually pay and upgrade your sterilizer, whether you're just going to try to figure out a way to optimize your costs to sterilize what you need, or whether you're going to, as Caitlin referred to, work with your industry partners and vendor partners to figure out things like offsite sterilization or other options. These are going to be costs that you need to understand, and you need to be clear that there's no way around it. You've got to spend money on sterilization. The next is equipment, and I'm talking about the basic equipment, the knife, the fork, and the spoon that you need to do the operation. And obviously, there's a cost to all of those things as well. And we need to spend that money, and that's just something we need to understand. Your drapes, your medications for anesthesia, your overhead, just your general overhead, rent, lights, electricity, heat, all of those things. I guess if you have Stefan's OR, you've got the sun heating you, so it's not so bad. But for those of us who don't have windows in our ORs, we got to worry about heat and air conditioning as well. And then finally, it's your human resources, right? Your people. All of these are your fixed overhead. And one of the most important things to figure out is, what are my fixed costs? Because guess what? They're fixed. You can't change them. You can't do anything different about them. And you need to build that into your financial calculation to understand how you're going to spend your $8,610. Now, you can see any number you want out there for about what these cost in our center. And in some of the centers that we have worked with over the years, we've seen fixed costs for something like a joint replacement go anywhere from about $2,000 to $3,500. So I kind of rounded it down a little bit. I've seen some people push it down a bit based on the cost of labor, but $1,800 to $3,000, about that. And if you think about it, right there, that's a third of the money you're getting paid by Medicare at this point. So that is something to think about. Then come your variable costs. And again, we heard Caitlin reference this earlier, that implant costs and variable costs can be more than your human costs, more than your costs of labor. And these costs are your implants, these costs are your dressings, these costs are your variety of things you utilize for pain management. We saw an example of this in the live surgery earlier with the periarticular injection that Dr. Kreutzer chooses. But it's also the other medications that you're giving patients around the time of surgery, whether it's your whether it's your local anesthetic, whether it's your IV medications, whether it's your TXA in multiple accounts. In one way or another, each of these are variable costs, and variable costs are probably where you have the most opportunity to make some decisions and do some things that can really help understand your finances. And your variable costs get you about I would say somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000, right? Most of that is in your implant, but things like dressings can be expensive, things like medications can be expensive, and not to say that they're worth it or not worth it, but recognize that if you just use this as your baseline and you took the $3,000 from our first slide and the $6,000 from this slide, you are now officially in the red, right? You have now lost money on your $8,610 reimbursement from Medicare. And so that's why monitoring these and understanding what these are absolutely critical when you're starting your program or when you're growing your program, and certainly when you're trying to scale a program. So the last thing are your optional costs. Your optional costs are things like advanced dressings, are things like fluoroscopy, navigation, robotics, like we saw earlier. These are things you could do the surgery without it. You might not choose to, but that's why I call them the optional costs. And the thing about, especially in orthopedics, the optional costs, when you start to look at them, they are unlimited. You could spend as much money as you wanted across the board, and you could make the surgery cost $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 if you really wanted to. And so optional costs are really where you have to see, like, what is the value and what can we really do? So how do you manage costs? How do you really manage these costs, and what's the right way to do it? And I think there's two keys to managing costs. The two keys to managing costs are, one, process standardization where possible. I'm not saying everyone has to do everything exactly the same, but the more you can standardize, what drapes are we going to use? What dressings are we going to use? What instruments are we going to use? What technology are we going to use? What medications are we going to use? What pathways are we going to use? The more you can standardize, the easier it is to use economies of scale to drive down cost. So the more you can standardize, the easier it's going to be for you to control your costs. But that has to come along with the second principle, which is transparency. Everyone who's at your center needs to know every dollar spent and every dollar made. For a long time in healthcare, doctors always thought that business was a dirty word, and many of us didn't get involved in the business side of what we do. And I think that's a big mistake. I think that's been one of the big drivers of increasing costs, because we just didn't know, nor did we care, nor, to our last panel, were we incentivized to care. We weren't aligned in a way that it really mattered, but transparency is key. Everyone involved in taking care of patients is a smart person. They are caring individuals who bring empathy to the table in whatever role they play. And if you show them the reality of what's going on, they're going to make better decisions. So I like to think of surgery centers as the ultimate example of radical transparency. At most of our centers, and at my old center that we used to run, everyone saw everything: downstream revenue, upstream costs, every dollar spent in every single surgery. And guess what? Everyone's names were on there. So Surgeon A and Surgeon B and Surgeon C knew exactly what each of us were doing, exactly what we were spending, and exactly where we saw value and no value. So in my mind, what you do clinical evidence, right? Every decision you make should be based on clinical evidence. The patient must remain the center of the equation no matter what. But then you want to get as much pathway consensus as possible. As much as you can do exactly the same on your pathway, the better. Then if you can get product consensus, that's even better. Then you can say, we are going to use only this dressing, or only these two dressings, or only this drape, or whatever it is. And the more you can do that, the more you can use that economy of scale to bring down your costs. And then finally, if you can't get to product consensus, you can get price consensus, where at least you say, okay, we're not going to tell you what implant to use, because that's not the way we practice here. But we are going to say that every implant that comes in here has to be this price and with this many trays required for sterilization, which is exactly how we did it in my old center, where we said it doesn't matter what implant you use, but it can't be more than 3 trays worth of instrumentation, and the price has to be X. And I think if you do that, especially if you have a contract that you're not being paid for implants, and you need to know what your contracts are, right? If you have a pass-through implant contract, it's very different than a Medicare contract that doesn't cover implants. So you need to understand what your contracting looks like. As much as you can get price consensus can allow you to really control your costs. And then remember things like rebates from our vendor partners. Understand that these things exist and can be used to invest in capital within your center. Remember, you're not going to take rebates home as cash in your pocket. You're not going to get distributions from a rebate, but it certainly can help you with outfitting your center with capital expenses. And these are very good programs that you can get along with your vendor partners. And then finally, the most important thing to do is understand the difference between price and value. Many of these optional expenses are absolutely critical, and all of us want to do them because they drive value. So spending a little more money isn't always a bad thing. Just understand the difference between price and value. And it remains up to all of us to determine what is just more price and what is bringing more value. And I think we heard a lot about that this morning when we talked about the use of robotics in an ASC, where that brought value to what we were doing. And even though there's a price associated with it, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. So when you look at controlling costs and managing $8,610 for a total knee, you want to know your costs, know what they are, be transparent about them. You want to standardize wherever possible, and then really focus on the difference between price and value, because that's really what's going to drive the correct decision making that keeps the patient at the focus of everything we do. Thank you so much.